Welcome to the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. We're a museum that is meant to preserve and teach people about the history of the Japanese-American incarceration site located in northwestern Wyoming during World War II. When the Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor, there were about 140,000 people with Japanese heritage living in the continental United States, and about 90% of them lived on the West Coast. These people had already experienced about 60 years of anti-Asian racism, specifically anti-Japanese prejudice, and also the growing anti-immigrant sentiments that were becoming increasingly widespread in the early 1900s. All of that exploded after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Americans were accused of espionage, of sabotage, and they were also accused of being, by the inherent qualities of their race, somehow inherently un-American. As a result of this wartime hysteria and racism, ultimately the president signed Executive Order 9066. This gave military leaders the authority to exclude anyone they chose from anywhere that they deemed important to the defense of the United States. But what it was used for was to remove all of the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. In essence, General DeWitt designated a zone that ran the entire length of the West Coast. And he said that if you lived in that zone and you had Japanese heritage, which he defined as 1/16th, or in other words, having at least one great-great-grandparent who is Japanese, you had to leave. Unfortunately, many of the people in that zone didn't have the funds that they needed to be able to move, and the interior states didn't want them. And those two pressures led to the creation of what were called at the time, and technically were, concentration camps in the interior of the United States. What happened was that signs went up in Japanese American neighborhoods. When those signs went up, you knew you had about a week to 10 days to decide what you were going to do with anything that you could not pack into a suitcase. And then you were rounded up, and initially, the army hadn't even decided where the camps were going to be. So you were instead sent to racetracks or fairgrounds that had been converted into holding facilities. You generally stayed there a couple of months, and then you were packed onto trains and shipped off to one of the 10 camps in the interior. Heart Mountain was the northernmost of the camps, and it was the fourth largest. It had a total of 14,000 people over the course of 3 years. Its population generally ran around 10,500 at any one time, which, for a sense of scale, made it the third largest city in Wyoming at the time. And it really was a city. This is a place where people were living their lives. There was a high school, there were sports teams, there were clubs where people learned new skills or just found ways to fill their time. People lived here, people loved here, some people did die here, others were born. And the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center is dedicated to preserving the history of and telling the stories of those 14,000 people.